Alright, hello, and welcome back. Today we're going to go into the second video on the Mothman Precon. We're going to be analyzing my upgraded version, all the changes that I made to it. It's a very different deck than it does now, going into how I changed it, why I changed it, and the deck list for the upgraded version here. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it, and hope you enjoy. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's look at the commander first. So in the previous video, I talked about how my take on Mothman is that Mothman is fantastic card. I was really excited how it was going to work, but something that I did notice that I was kind of underwhelmed with about it was that in the original deck, I felt like it was too reliant on rad counters. So Mothman's ability itself, its primary ability is whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, put a 1/1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land creatures, or where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. So this triggers on instances of mill, and when you're focusing on just doing exclusively rad counters, that's going to be once on every player's upkeep, just once. But I branched out the deck so that you get some rad counter coverage from Mothman and some leftover proliferate, but I focused more on mill triggers. Some mill triggers that instances of mill that will mill me, some that will focus on my opponents, and others that will kind of hit both. But the idea behind it was I wanted to make it so that this deck triggered this commander more frequently than the original deck. So that was something that one of the changes that I made was upgrading the mill frequency in there. I also increased the presence of 1/1 counters, and I tried to focus the deck a little bit more into the placing of those 1/1 counters as well as the mill. So now its primary win conditions are combat damage through the 1/1 counters, but also uh, it has the ability to up and outright mill a player out while triggering this counter adding ability much faster. So let's go ahead and look at the spreadsheet on it real quick, and then we'll dive into the rest of the deck list. All right, so looking at the spreadsheets, the first thing of major note is the difference of CMC. So converted mana cost is much lower in the new version. We got 3.07 down from the original 3.61. Now, that number might not mean a whole lot to you, but it plays a huge role in how quickly you can get your deck rolling and off the ground. Um, so the new version is going to end up being so much more low to the ground, so much faster. I reduced the number of lands from 39 to 24 here, or to 34 here in the new one. Um, so that is pretty good. Gives me means more percentage of the deck is actual utility cards. Rather than lands. But with this lower CMC, I'm not going to need quite as many lands. And with the upgrades that I made to the ramp in the deck, we'll be just absolutely fine. Um, so with the looking at the land balance, if you remember back in the original down here, um, we have more green in our color ratio, followed by black, followed by blue. But if you look at the land balance, we have more black, followed by blue, followed by green, as represented in our lands. So in the new one, you can see we have still mostly green, but blue has overtaken black in the new version. And so I switched up the lands to reflect that. So we've got 16 green, 16 blue, and 15 black. Still pretty even across the board because we do want to be able to rely on being able to get each of our colors. but we do need more black than we do the other two colors, or less black than we do need the other two colors overall. Um, so that being said, kind of looked at all of those. I reduced the number of ramp cards in the deck, but I increased the quality of ramp. So this deck builds so much better, so much more efficiently than the original did. Um, Card draw, it's less focused on card draw and more focused on returning things from your graveyard because you're going to be milling. And so it does have a solid element of graveyard pull to compensate for the lesser draw mechanics. Um, so that's something to keep in mind. Um, we got about the same number of cards that allow you to control your opponent's board states. Um, and I don't think that protection number is correct in this in the new deck, but neither here nor there. As you can see in the new deck, as I mentioned earlier, is a primary focus on 1/1 counters and mill triggers, so we can get Mothman firing off more efficiently. Lot less emphasis on rads. There's only like 8 cards in here, including Commander, that even touch rads. And then there is a solid presence of cards that when a specific type of card or a card is milled or enters the graveyard, then uh, execute certain effects. So that is pretty darn solid over the original deck here. Again, fix that land balance. So overall, the deck operates and feels a lot smoother than the original Precon does. But let's go ahead and hop into the deck list, and I'll go over exactly why that is. All right, let's run through this. First card up, we got Lightning Greaves. Equipped creature has Haste and Shroud. Great 2-cost early, 0-cost equip. Allows you to just fire cards off. Tap 1, play a thing. Tap 2, play this, and then you can get fired off real quick. Great quintessential card. Part of the original deck. Actually, no, it wasn't. That was a card that I added to it. This one is part of the original deck, which is why I got a little scrambled up there. Cathedral Acolyte is a 2-cost. 1/2. Each creature you control with a counter on it has ward 1, and tap. Put a 1/1 counter on target creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So, good thing about this, with the new setup, you're going to be producing more 1/1 counters than you were with the old setup. And if it was a great card in the old setup, it's a phenomenal card in the current setup. Now we get our first new addition here after that Lightning Greaves. Here we have the Night Howler, which is a 3-cost 0/0 enchantment creature that has a bestow. So I can either tap 3 and play it as a creature, or I can tap 4 and play it as an aura on one of my creatures. Night Howler and Enchanted Creature each get +X, where X is the number of creature cards in all graveyards. So that all there is huge, because your self mill is going to build into that, your opponent mill is going to build into that, and all around you can just get a really, really solid balance, or really, really solid buff on one of your creatures from that, which will help with other cards that I'll get into later. We have a new addition from the Doctor Who set. Danny Pink is a 4-cost 4/3 mentor creature that has creatures you control have, whenever 1 or more counters are put on this creature, for the first time each turn, draw a card. So with this guy and this guy, if you mill enough cards out, you're going to be drawing a card for each creature you control once a turn. And this also applies to your opponent's turn. So if on your opponent's turn you have things that cause them to mill, then that would give you more card draw. And so you will end up having a whole ton of card draw in this deck. One upgrade that I might recommend in adding to on top of the deck that I'm proposing right now, I only have a little bit in here, but that is infinite hand size. Because with this guy, you can really build your hand up really fast. So Danny Pink, solid card, perfect addition, I think, in my opinion, for a deck that specializes in building wide and putting lots of 1/1 counters on lots of things. Here we got a 1-cost green sorcery called Bushwhack. Choose one, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. Now, the reason why this is in here is number one, you have an option of either ramping or control. So with this deck, the likelihood that your creatures are going to be stronger than your opponent's creatures is decently high, because with Mothman and the other 1/1 counter build creatures in this build, you're going to have big creatures. So you'll probably be able to use this as essentially a destroy target creature, um, should you choose. So for a 1-cost, absolutely fantastic addition. 5-cost Colonian Hydra with 0/0 with trample, but it enters the battlefield with 4 1/1 counters on it. Whenever it attacks, double the number of 1/1 counters on each creature you control. I don't even think I need to explain that one. I really just don't, because yeah. This is an engine that takes this deck from 10, turns it to 11. Michaeloth, almost the same sort of a level of card here. We got a 5-cost 4/4 with Devour 2. As this creature enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. This creature enters the battlefield with twice that many 1/1 counters on it. So it enters, you can sacrifice any number of creatures, put a bunch of 1/1 counters on it. But at the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 green sapling creature token onto the battlefield for each 1/1 counter on Michaeloth. So I replaced the Screeching Scorch Beast with the Michaeloth, not for its Devour 2 ability. In fact, I would recommend, if you use this build, you don't even bother with the Devour 2. Because with Mothman, you can and all the other counter utilities, you can just buff Michaeloth up so quick. And so you're just spitting out 1/1 saplings like it's no one's business. And so you get way more tokens with Michaeloth than you did with the Screeching Scorch Beast, which was the 6-cost higher mana class, so 6-cost black creature that whenever a non-land was milled, you put a 2/2 zombie onto the field, and you could only execute that once a turn. So you'll get way more mileage out of the Michaeloth there. Returning card, Fraying Sanity from the original deck. 3-cost aura. At the beginning of each end step, enchanted player mills X cards, where X is the number of cards put into that graveyard from anywhere this turn. So essentially, it doubles all of your mill and causes them to mill an extra card for each card that they either discarded or that was destroyed or whatever the case is. So it's kind of like a mill echo. Here we go. Another one of our ramp cards is a 3-cost 3/3 called Irenis. Yep. Gloomstalker. Sorry, I didn't think I was reading that right for a second. Gloomstalker. 3/3 with Death Touch. Whenever Irenis Gloomstalker attacks, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I threw this one in there because it's regular. You're gonna be milling yourself. You're gonna be milling your opponents, and it says from your graveyard. So as you are milling, if a land goes in there, you can swing with her, get an extra land drop per turn. Very good for building up that mana ramp that I was talking about earlier. Crypt Incursion. 3-cost instant. Exile all creature cards from target player's graveyard. You gain 3 life for each card exiled this way. For a 3-cost instant, it can save your life. It might end up depowering your deck a little bit. You're losing out on some of those creature cards that you're milling. But at the same time, gaining 3 life per creature card. If you have a graveyard that you've pretty well milled out, you can play that, give yourself a little bit of a second wind so you can finish off the rest of the table. Very solid, in my opinion. Inexorable Tide returns as well. It's a 5-cost. Whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. It's good for rad counters. It's good for 1/1 counters. So it's good for this deck. Aqueous Form. So with all of our 1/1 counters, I introduced the element of unblockable to this deck in minor ways. I've got a couple of cards that provide this, one of which being Aqueous Form. 1-cost aura, enchanted creature can't be blocked whenever enchanted creature attacks, scry 1. So it gives you a little bit of card utility and allows you to land with some of your bigger creatures if they don't happen to have trample. So very solid, very solid. Mind Grind is a black-blue X. Each opponent reveals reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals X land cards. Then they put all cards revealed this way into their graveyard. X can't be cast as 0. Couple of things about this. Each opponent. So you're hitting, if you're playing 4 players, if you're playing a 4-player game, you're hitting 3 players, are each milling until they hit lands. So this is a huge, absolutely massive mill card that will. I've seen this card mill out 80 cards at once in the past, and that was a particularly amazing game, and I was playing against more than 4 opponents. But either way, it is still amazing card. Definitely makes the cut into this deck. Now here we go. We got one of our legendary editions, Taigam Sidisi's Hand, 5-cost 4/4. With skip your draw step. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. Something to note about this, I checked, that does trigger as mill. So things like Mothman or other other permanents that have whenever cards are milled triggers, this will trigger them. And you can choose what card ends up being in your hand. So you're feeding your graveyard, you're feeding your hand, and it has this really unique, nice utility ability here of pay black and tap. Exile X cards from your graveyard. Target creature gets gets -X until end of turn. So you also have that element of board control as well, allowing you to put yourself in more favorable positions. Branching Evolution is a returning card, 3-cost enchantment. Whenever one or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many 1/1 counters are put on that creature instead. Absolutely fire for its mana cost. Another returner, Winding Constrictor. Black-green 2/3 creature. If one or more counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1 are put on that permanent instead. If you would get one or more counters, you get that many +1 of each of those counters instead. So that can be good or bad. It would affect poison counters on you if that happens, but it will also affect rad counters and experience counters on you. So that is very much a bonus. All right, another returning, the Master Transcendent. 4-cost tricolor 2/4 legendary. When it enters the battlefield, target player gets 2 rad counters, so there's some rad counter utility on there. But its primary purpose in the deck is tap, put target creature card in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control. It is a green mutant with base power and toughness 3/3. That is a amazing card in a graveyard. So that forms some of the backbone of that card draw that I was talking about, that graveyard return. Phenomenal. Can be a game changer. You can take what your opponents have if it benefits you. Here we have Jace's Erasure. 2-cost enchantment. Whenever you draw a card, you may have target player put the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So basically, whenever you draw, they mill. Great in combination with Danny Pink, because that can kind of feed itself for a little bit. Not indefinitely, but it can feed itself fairly well. All right. Tribute to the Wild is a 2-cost instant. Each opponent sacrifices an artifact or enchantment. Only hits opponents, so that's good. Sacrifices an artifact or enchantment. It just makes it so you can be like, yep, let's make this board state a little bit better. For a 2-cost, very solid. You could also swap that out for, like, if you wanted to do like a Naturalize or something like that. It was a 2-cost destroy target. I put this one in there, get a little bit more blanket coverage for playing against multiple people. Windborn Muse is a 4-cost blue 2/2 creature. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts the top X cards from his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards in his or her hand. This is particularly good against decks that are causing you and everybody to draw cards, like group hug decks. Fantastic if everybody's got a full hand, that's wonderful. If people don't have a full hand, then that's okay. But in general, you're going to want to hit cards. Sorry, cat distracted me there for a second. But in general, very solid. You'll definitely hit at least a couple of cards, which is all you really need to get some Mothman trigger, which is kind of the whole point. This just adds another on each turn. There's gonna be some extra mill, unless a player is top decking, at which point you have an advantage. Anyway, here we go. Diabolic Servitude is a 4-cost black enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. When the creature put into the battlefield with Diabolical Servitude dies, exile it and return Diabolical Servitude to its owner's hand. When Diabolic Servitude leaves the battlefield, exile the creature put onto the battlefield with Diabolic Servitude. It's got a lot of words on it, but essentially, let's say that Dreamborn Muse is in my graveyard and I'm going to play Diabolic Servitude. It's a normal enchantment, not an aura, so it just enters the battlefield. And I'm going to return Dreamborn Muse from my graveyard to the battlefield. If Dreamborn Muse dies, it gets exiled instead of going into the graveyard. And when it's exiled, I then return this to my hand. If this leaves the battlefield, while the creature before Dreamborn Muse leaves the battlefield, this creature gets exiled, and Diabolic Servitude enters the graveyard. So, it's a very solid, repeatable graveyard return. That's why it's in there. Can be a little bit annoying if you end up pulling out a card that you need, and then they just snipe Diabolic Servitude, and then you have to exile it. But it is what it is. I like the reusability, and for a 4-cost, that's not bad at all. Herald of the Secret Streams is a 4-cost 2/3. Remember how I was saying earlier, I added some unblockable in here. This is the instance of that. Creatures you control with 1/1 counters on it can't be blocked. Just straight up outright. If it has a 1/1 counter on it, you can't touch it. That's self-explanatory. Here we get to the first of our powerful ramp cards in here. Kami of Whispered Hopes is a 3-cost 1/1. If one or more 1/1 counters would be put on a permanent you control, that many +1 1/1 counters are put on that permanent instead. So you get that 1/1 counter bonuses, right? Just like everything else, that affects all of your other creatures. But it also has tap, add X mana of any one color where X is Kami of Whispered Hopes power. So if you put 1/1 counters on this thing, it'll also get that extra bonus of an extra 1/1 counter on it. But then you can tap it for even more and even more and even more and even more mana. So really quickly, you can use that to ramp into having a ton of mana. More mana than this deck is really going to need, because it's got a relatively average CMC. Nothing particularly high or crazy about it. Here we got a Gnarled Colony, is a 2-cost 2/2 creature with a kicker ability of if it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 extra 1/1 counters on it. For a 3-cost kicker, you don't really need that in this deck. I mean, you're gonna have a much better opportunity to put more 1/1 counters on it a lot easier. But the real thing about this card here, each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has trample. So each creature with a 1/1 counter on it has unblockable with a 4-cost. Well, here it has trample with a 2-cost. So still able to get some of that damage through, and when you end up with your bigger creatures, that can make all the difference. Got another returning card here, Raoul Troubleshooter. It's a 3-cost 1/4 that once during each of your turns you may cast a spell from among cards in your graveyard that were milled this turn. That is very useful. That is just super useful. And it also has a tap of each player mills one card, which is a nice small level or low level, just quick tap mill card that can trigger your Mothman. I love that in there. All right, here we got Nashi, Searcher in the Dark, 2-cost, 2/2 legendary creature with Menace. So Menace is important because Menace means it can't be blocked by. It can only be blocked by 2 or more creatures. So you can't just block it one-on-one, which makes it very difficult to deal with, especially once you start putting counters on it with Mothman and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. When Nashi, Searcher in the Dark, deals combat damage to a player, you mill that many cards. You may put any number of legendary and or enchantment cards from among them into your hand. If you put no cards into your hand this way, put a 1/1 counter on Nashi. So that is another one of those card draw from your graveyard while you're milling sorts of scenarios. Does count as instance of mill, so you can choose if you would rather have a creature enter the battle or enter the graveyard so that you can add more counters, or if you would rather it in your hand. You know, however you wanna roll that, you can. But it's there. And it's really low cost. You can get it really early game with Menace and 1/1 counters. I played this deck the other night. I saw this used very effectively. Was excellent to have on my board state. Quintessential card in every mill deck, well, most of them that I've seen. Keening Stone is a 6-cost artifact with pay 5 and tap. Target player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, where X is the number of cards in that player's graveyard. You can use this mixed with a couple of other cards that I added in here. One turn a player can go from having 100 cards to having 0. Upkeep, lose, done. Now you have to generate the mana in order to play those cards, so you wouldn't be able to turn 1 win like that, but it's still absolutely phenomenal. Keening Stone, very, very useful. Arcane Signet is a 2-cost tap, add 1 mana of any color to your any color in your commander's color identity. Returning card from the original Fallout deck. Excellent mana rock. Here's a new addition, Trepanation Blade. 3-cost, equip 2. Whenever equipped creature attacks, defending player reveals cards from the top of his or her library until they reveal a land card. The creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each card revealed this way. That player puts the revealed cards into his or her graveyard. And so, combat buff adds to on top of the 1/1 counters. Also, mill creates more 1/1 counters. Just overall, just yes. Here's another one of those very powerful ramp cards, Rishkar Pima Renegade. So here's the thing about this. It's a 3-cost 2/2 creature that when it enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. So it enters the battlefield and you're distributing some counters here. But each creature you control with a counter on it has tap, add green to your mana pool. So now we can turn all of our creatures into mana rocks if we want. Very solid. Especially if you think about it in terms of the Mycoloth Saprolings. So if you get Mycoloth going, right, you end up generating a whole bunch of little 1/1 creatures. Use Mothman to just start putting 1/1 counters on a whole bunch of various ones of those. Each instance of doing that, now you have an extra just mana rock just sitting there that isn't one of your main creatures that you can swing with or that you want to swing with, but is available to you if you want it. Returning card, the Soul Ring. 1 cost, tap, add 2 colorless. One of the most quintessential commander creature or commander cards that exist. All right. This is one of the 2 commanders for a deck that I built way back when that was functioned very similarly to this deck. Long time ago, I scrapped the deck and I kind of rebuilt this deck using some of the major cards from that. This is one of them. Fanex, God of Destruction. 5 cost, 4/7, indestructible, legendary enchantment creature. As long as your devotion to blue and black is less than 7, Fanex isn't a creature. For those of you who aren't entirely sure what devotion is, it's the number of colored mana symbols up in the converted mana costs of permanents you control. So if you have enchantments, if you have creatures, so you would just count the number of blue and black symbols in the mana costs of permanents you control, and that's the casting costs, not the abilities down below. And so if you have 7 or more of those, Fanex becomes a creature, but until then, he's just sits over as an enchantment. But his main draw, creatures you control have tap, target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is this creature's toughness. So imagine, if you will, you have a creature that has a whole bunch of 1/1 counters. Let's also imagine you have another creature that has a whole bunch of 1/1 counters, and another creature that has a whole bunch of 1/1 counters on it. Right? So you have all 3 of these creatures, and I'm going to go ahead and tap Mothman to use Fenix's ability. Say Mothman has 5 1/1 counters on it. So I'm going to say, okay, yeah. I'm going to tap Mothman to have you mill 5 plus the base of 3. I'm going to have you mill 8 cards. Well, if you mill 3 non-land cards, then I put a 1/1 counter on Mothman, this card, and this card. Right? And so then I tap this one for 1 extra. Right? Because it milled with this, but it milled with it, this ability was used on Mothman, which triggered Mothman's counter ability, which put a counter on this guy so I could tap him for more, which triggered Mothman's ability so that I could put a 1/1 counter on this guy so that I'm tapping him for more, and it just goes on and on and on and on. And so the more creatures that you have, the bigger and bigger and bigger you can build. Fanex just synergizes with this deck so well. He's one of the couple of core cards that I have in this deck. Moving on to the Fertilid, one of our other ramp cards. We got a 3 cost 0/0 creature that enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters on it. So already we got 1/1 counters in here. Pay 2 and remove a 1/1 counter from Fertilid. Target player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffles. So most of the time you would look at that and you would be like, oh, I can pay 2 and drop a land, extra land, and then pay 2 and drop an extra land, and then Fertilid is dead. Well, we have Mothman, so we can put more 1/1 counters on it. So because we can put more 1/1 counters on it, we can almost guarantee a land drop every turn directly onto the battlefield. So can be very helpful, and it's search your library for a basic land card, meaning it'll help you with your color balance, it'll help you acquire the lands, and it just drops them right onto the battlefield, so it doesn't even take up your land per turn. Alright, returning call card Vexing Radgull is a 2 cost 1/2 with flying. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 rad counters. If they didn't have any rad counters, otherwise proliferate. Pretty darn good. If you're attacking in conjunction with Mothman, the odds are is that your opponents will always have a rad counter, so you get that proliferate trigger pretty often. And if you, for some reason, lose Mothman, you can still get those rad counters thrown on there. And if you hold Mothman back, or however the case is, still you get your rad counter utilities. For a 2 cost flying, very, very, very good addition to this deck, in my opinion. Now we got a game winner. Guilt Feeder is a 5-cost 0/4 with Fear. What that means is it can't be blocked except for by artifact creatures and or black creatures. So it's already got an element of being unblockable to it. But whenever it attacks and isn't blocked, defending player loses 1 life for each card in his or her graveyard. So if the opponent has 40 cards in their graveyard, they're pretty much done with Guilt Feeder. And in one go. And if you're hitting them with Guilt Feeder repeatedly, and with the unblockable in this deck and the unblockable already on that card, chances are you're going to get a really, really good amount of damage out of the Guilt Feeder. And okay, you might look at it and say, oh, it's only a 0/4. Well, for now. For now. Moving on from the Guilt Feeder, we have a Planeswalker, the only Planeswalker in this new version of the deck. Wrenn and Realmbreaker is a 3-cost with a base loyalty counter of 4. It has a innate ability of lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Very good for a tricolor land balance. In addition to that, up to 1 target land you control becomes a... having trouble reading that. A 3/3 elemental creature token with vigilance, hexproof, and haste until your next turn. It is still land. That's its +1 loyalty ability. Its -2 is mill 3 cards. You may put a permanent card from among the milled cards into your hand. And the -7 is you gain an emblem with you may play lands and cast permanent spells from your graveyard. So you get graveyard return, you've got mill, you've got ramp, you've got pretty much everything that this deck does in a Planeswalker. In a 3-cost Planeswalker. So, very, very utilitarian and all-around useful. Hadana's Climb. This is another reason why the land count is so low. I included this for 1/1 counter utility at the beginning of combat on your turn. So it's a 3-cost enchantment. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. Then if that creature has 3 or more 1/1 counters on it, transform Hadana's Climb. And its transformed state is a land called Winged Temple of Orzaka, which is a legendary land. And it has tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Or tap 3, pay 3 and tap. Target creature you control gains flying and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is its power. In the deck with a bunch of 1/1 counters already, you're going to probably play this and transform it almost immediately. And, yeah, it'll be nice, simple, quick, easy, clear cut. Boom, have an extra land and put a 1/1 counter on a creature. Corpsejack Menace, another returner from the original deck, one of the most powerful 1/1 counter cards in this deck, aside from the Colonian Hydra. If 1 or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many are put on it instead. It's a 4/4 creature. We have Inspiring Call, another returner from the original deck, as a 3-cost instant. Draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. So you got some protection, you got some card draw. Revolves around creatures having 1/1 counters on them. Thassa, God of the Sea. 3-cost 5/5 indestructible. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature. We already talked about definition of what that devotion is. Thassa has, at the beginning of your upkeep, Scry 1. Good for kind of seeing what's ahead, and you can avoid milling cards that you particularly want to, or try to. But its primary purpose in this deck is its pay 2 ability. For target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. So if you don't have a more efficient way of causing creatures to not be blocked, pop Thassa out, get a little bit of extra oomph on your swings. Guardian Project returns, a 4-cost enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. So we're pretty much on that one again, drawing a card every time a creature enters the battlefield under our control, because we don't this deck doesn't specialize in any of the things that would make that anything else. Nyx Weaver, it's a 3-cost 2/3 enchantment creature with reach. At the beginning of your upkeep, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. So you got some constant, regular, reliable self-mill, which can be very helpful. Loading up your graveyard, use it to fuel up your graveyard return. It also has a 3-cost ability. Pay 3, exile Nyx Weaver, return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. So you get an element of self-mill, but in a pinch, if you need to, you can get rid of that self-mill to bounce a creature, bounce a card, not just a creature, any card, back from your graveyard into your hand. Alright, one of the other mill powerhouse cards, Traumatize, is a 5-cost blue sorcery. Target player puts the top half of his or her library, rounded down, into his or her graveyard. Just gone. Just done. Very powerful card there. Mirko Vosk, one of the other key cards next to Phoenix. It's a 5-cost flying. Whenever Mirko Vosk, the Mind Drinker, deals combat damage to a player, that player reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals 4 land cards and then puts those cards into his or her graveyard. It's a creature cipher version of the Mind Grind card. Except for instead of hitting everybody, it hits one player, but it's repeatable. Those cards, the cards that cause you to mill until you hit a whole bunch of lands. I'm telling you. You get a lot of good stuff, especially on the repeatable ones. Alright. So, we got Deep Muck Desperado here. It's a 3-cost 2/4. Whenever you commit a crime, each opponent mills 3 cards. This ability triggers only once each turn. So again, this is a smaller instance of mill, but it is an instance of mill that can trigger cause Mothman to be triggered. And you're going to be doing it fairly often. Any card that's target player mills, or destroy target creature, or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, all of that is classified as committing a crime. Targeting opponents and anything that they control, or anything in their graveyard or anything like that, is considered a crime. So that's, yeah. Whenever you target anything that your opponent has, it's a crime. For example, Wilt. It's a 2-cost destroy target artifact or enchantment with cycling 2, so you get a little bit of card draw. You're able to remove artifact or enchantment. Nice and cheap. Straightforward there. Mind Funeral. This is kind of like a budget / more efficient version of that Mind Grind card we were talking about a minute ago. It's a black-blue 3-cost sorcery. Target opponent reveals cards from the top of his or her library until 4 land cards are revealed. That player puts all cards revealed this way into his or her graveyard. So this and Mirko Vosk are the same thing, except for Mirko Vosk costs 2 more mana and essentially has this card on Cypher. Both of them absolutely fire, and when used together, you can really run your opponents out of their cards really fast. Forced Adaptation is a 1-cost green aura. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 counter on enchanted creature. You can play this early game on any creature that you want, and every turn you're going to get an extra 1/1 counter. And once you get your 1/1 counter utilities up, excuse me. Once you get your 1/1 counter utilities up, then you'll be able to just double that. And so instead of putting 1, you'll be putting 4. You'll be putting 8 counters even on one creature at the beginning of your upkeep. So definitely included that one in there. We have Mutant's Prey is a 1-cost Target creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it fights target creature an opponent controls. There's another, essentially, because of how big the creatures are hopefully going to be, that's essentially a destroy target creature for 1. Now, that's not always going to be the case, and you can't really rely on that to be the case, but it does reduce that CMC. You can get that going really early, and it's just overall a good option. Forgotten Ancient. We got a 4-cost 0/3. This is one of those cards in this deck that is an absolute 1/1 counter engine. Whenever a player casts a spell, opponents, doesn't matter. Whenever a spell is cast, you put a 1/1 counter on this creature. Again, think about this in terms of all the doublers. So you can easily build this dude up really fast, especially in conjunction with Mothman. Then, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of 1/1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. So it doesn't say other target creature, it just says other creatures. It doesn't specify. So you can put any number of 1/1 counters that are on him onto any number of creatures that you control. You can, as it's just a 1-for-1 exchange. You get, okay, this counter is now on this guy, this counter is now on this guy, this counter is now on that guy. But the interesting thing to think about, let's say that you have a Winding Constrictor out. Winding Constrictor is that 2-cost snake that whenever a counter would be put on a creature, you put that many counters plus 1. So let's say that I cast a spell. I'm going to put 2 counters on this guy. Let's say I cast another spell, so I put 2 more counters on this guy, so that's 4 counters. And then let's say you cast a spell, right? And so building and building and building and building. Now, let's say it comes back to my turn, and let's say that for argument's sake, he has 8 counters on him. At the beginning of my upkeep, I can move a 1/1 counter onto each creature I control of those 8, which count as a single 1/1 counter being put, which would then get fed through the Winding Constrictor, which causes it, instead of being 1, to being 2. So, essentially, whenever you cast a spell on my next upkeep, or I cast a spell, or anybody casts a spell, on my next upkeep, I'm adding 4 1/1 counters to creatures I control for each spell, or to a creature I control for each spell, rather than, you know what I'm saying? So, very useful, very, just absolute engine, like I was saying earlier. Returning is the Tato Farmer. Is a 3-cost 1/4 landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may get 2 rad counters. It's optional may. Tap, put target land card in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control, tapped. So that's similar to that 3-cost Druid that we had, except for this one will also bring back lands from your opponent's graveyards also. So, excellent ramp card. Okay. This is the third major card in this deck next to Mirko Vosk and Fenix, but this one is probably even bigger. Consuming Aberration is a 5-cost blue-black creature. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. Not creature cards, not number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. It's all opponent's graveyards. So you play a card like that Mind Grind. All of your opponents are milling tons of cards, and this thing just gets massive. Not only that, whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals a land card, then put those cards into his or her graveyard. So whenever you cast a spell, you not only do you have a good chance of triggering this 3 times by casting a single spell. This guy is also getting absolutely massive. And if you put a counter on him, then you get your utilities out. You can give him everything. You can give him Menace. You can give him Unblockable. You can give him Trample. You can give him Ward 1, you can give him all kinds of junk. So, yeah, Consuming Apparition is an absolute beast. Fantastic. I say that a lot, I'm noticing. But that's okay. That is probably the most core card in this entire deck is that Consuming Apparition. Not required to win a game, but when you get it, it's the most game changing. Hinder Vines. It's a 3-cost green instant. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn by creatures with no 1/1 counters on them. So you can play that as a defensive. You can play that as offensive. You attack and you get blocked. And you can be like, yep, you don't do anything. Or if they're attacking you, you can be like, yep, you don't do anything. But it doesn't hit you. So if you're attacked, for example, and they're attacking you because they're like, oh, if he blocks, he's going to lose a bunch of creatures. Well, you play that, you aren't going to lose any of your creatures, and you can kill a bunch of things. You know what I mean? Even if they have Death Touch, it doesn't even matter. You can just absolutely destroy them. So very good for protection and utility if you use it right. It can be a very aggressive card. Duskmantle Guild Mage. This is 1/2 of a win condition. It's a 2-cost 2/2. Pretty low to the ground, very simple, but it has a pay 3 ability. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere this turn, that player loses 1 life. So we've seen some of the bigger mills in this deck. So I can tap 3, and then I can play a spell, which will trigger Consuming Apparition, which will deal a whole bunch of damage. And then I can do it again, and then I can do it again, and then I can attack with Mirko Vosk, and then I can play Mind Grind, and then, you know what I'm saying? Traumatize, all these things with Duskmantle Guild Mage will kill people very, very quickly. And it's an opponent, it's not target opponents. So you trigger this, and it's active for the entire board. And so if you, depending on what cards you get, you can end up just obliterating them. I was talking about creatures you control with 1/1 counter being able to have menace. This is where that comes from. 3-cost 0/0 Haggard Constrictor enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters on it. Each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has menace. Again, menace is that it can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures. So you get a little bit of element of unblockable there. Declaration of Not. This is a very annoying card to play against. Especially if you use it in a way that will make everybody angry. It's a 2-cost blue enchantment. As it comes into play, name a card. You can pay 1 blue to counter target spell with that name. If you were to play this and target your opponent's commander, they wouldn't be able to play it. They would try and it would get countered. And they'd try and they would get countered. And you could just counter their commander the entire game. A lot of times when players build their commander decks, without their commander, their deck kind of falls. And so with Declaration of Not, until it's removed, you can significantly cripple one of your opponents. So included as a control card, absolutely fantastic. Deadbridge Chant is a 6-cost black-green enchantment. When it enters, you mill 10 cards. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose a card at random in your graveyard. If it's a creature card, put it straight onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it in your hand. Very good with that self-mill, and also reliable graveyard return every turn. You're getting something back, whether it's what you want or not, but it contributes to that card draw and board state. Being able to maintain your board state with this by either putting things in your hand. It'll also allow you to reuse things like Traumatize, Mind Grind, some of those bigger instants or sorceries that once you use them, they're gone. Well, Deadbridge Chant can go ahead and bring them back, has a chance to. It is random, so that is something to keep in mind, but still absolutely integral card for this deck here. Elixir of Immortality is a 1-cost artifact with pay 2 and tap. You gain 5 life and shuffle Elixir of Immortality and your graveyard into their owner's library. This is kind of a safety card just in case you find yourself accidentally milling yourself to death. You can use this to kind of rectify that situation really quick. So remember how I said that Duskmantle Guildmage was part of a combo? Well, it combos with a lot of cards, but particularly with Mindcrank, which is a 2-cost artifact. Whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So let's go back to Duskmantle Guildmage and pop that back out on the field real quick. The thing about this combination here, whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, that player loses a life. And then so when that player loses a life, they mill a card. And so when they mill a card, they lose a life. So they're back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But the interesting thing about this is that all you have to do is make, once you get both of these on the field and you have Duskmantle activated, all you got to do is get each of your opponents to mill one card. That's it. They mill one card and they're going to mill themselves until they're dead, or they're going to mill themselves until they're out of library cards. So yeah, Mindcrank, absolutely fantastic. The other thing about that is, unlike a 4-player game, if your players are attacking, if other players are attacking each other and dealing combat damage, that will still trigger Mindcrank, and so they will be feeding you by attacking other people. So that can also very much help and give you some more triggers on the Mothman here. We got Viconia Drow Apostate, which is a 3-cost 2/3 legendary. At the beginning of your upkeep, there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard. You may return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand. So another random upkeep graveyard return. It's a creature card specifically, but still very useful. Got 4-cost Sharktocrab is a 4/4. Kind of a weird card to have in here, but consider it has adapt 1 of pay 4, so you can pay 4 to put a 1/1 counter on it. I wouldn't even bother using that because this is going to be so much more efficient mana wise. But whenever 1 or more 1/1 counters are put on Sharktocrab, tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature does not untap during its controller's next untap step. So if you use this to put a 1/1 counter on this, tap target creature and it doesn't untap on its controller's next untap step. And then say it happens again. Say you small mills and you keep triggering it, and you keep triggering it, and you keep triggering it, and you keep loading it, and you keep loading it, and you keep loading it. And then as you load it, then you swing with Colonian Hydra or whatever, and it loads more. And you can tap your opponent's entire army out and give you more utility, more time, and more of an opening to just absolutely obliterate them if you don't have the unblockable yet. So Sharktocrab allows you to control your opponent's board state very effectively. Returning, we got Hardened Scales again. 1-cost green enchantment. If 1 or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, add that many +1 1/1 counters to it instead. Following that, we have Campfire. 1-cost artifact. Pay 1 and tap, you gain 2 life. Pay 2 and tap, exile Campfire, put all commanders you can own from the command zone and from your graveyard into your hand. Then shuffle your graveyard into your library. That's the primary ability that has caused this to be in this deck. So, more protection from milling yourself out. Also, if your commander has died, you can put it in your hand and be able to cast it for its proper mana cost instead of the aggravated mana cost for recast. Primal Cocoon, very similar to the Forced Adaptation from earlier. It's a 1-cost enchantment aura. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 counter on enchanted creature, but it has, when enchanted creature attacks or blocks, sacrifice Primal Cocoon. So it's the same sort of a thing, but while it's building up, you're not going to be able to attack or block with it, which will be kind of annoying. Coming down to our last couple of cards here, we got Glowing One returns with a 3-cost 2/2 green creature with Death Touch. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get 4 rad counters. Whenever a player mills a non-land card, then you gain a life. So you got your non-land being milled as a utility, and Wow, there we go. Sorry. And low cost, adding rad counters, very good card. And the final card of our non-lands, Vulturous Zombie, is a 5-cost 3/3 with flying. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, put a 1/1 counter on Vulturous Zombie. Needs very little to no explanation on that. So that's kind of the overview of the card by card on all of the individual pieces of this deck. I'm going to go into the lands here in just a second and then kind of give you an overview of what happened and how the deck felt after I played it. All right, jumping right into these lands here real quick. We've got Temple of Malady returns as the black-green scry land. We have Terramorphic Expanse, which is tap and sacrifice it to search your library for a basic land card and have it put it onto the battlefield tapped. Going with that is the Evolving Wilds that does the exact same thing. Nesting Grounds enters the battlefield untapped, taps for a colorless, and you have the extra ability of pay 1 and tap. Move a counter from target permanent you control onto another target permanent. Activate only as a sorcery. Mariposa Military Base, you may have it enter tapped, and if you do have it enter tapped, you can get 2 rad counters. But if you have it enter untapped, you don't get the rad counters, and you can immediately tap it. It also, for a colorless, it also has the ability of pay 5, tap it to draw a card. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each rad counter that you have. We've got Drowned Catacomb, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a island or a swamp. Here's the blue-green equivalent of that exact same land, Hinterland Harbor. Here's the blue-green Scryland Temple of Malady. I've got the Faded Pools are still in here. It's got cycling 2, so you can pay 2 and discard the card to draw a card. Discard this card to draw a card. Enters the battlefield tapped, but it taps for blue and black. Opulent Palace, it by default enters the battlefield tapped, but you can tap it for any of the Sultai colors that we have. Command Tower doesn't enter tapped. Tap it for any of the colors in your commander's identity. We got Viridescent Bog, which is a pay 1 colorless, tap to add black and green. We also have that exact same style of land in the blue-black color combination with Darkwater Catacombs, and in the blue-green combination with Overflowing Basin. We got Exotic Orchard. Tap, add 1 mana of any color to that a land an opponent controls could produce. We have Sunken Hollow, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Temple of Deceit, it's the blue-black scry land. Ash Barrens, tap to add 1 colorless. Basic land cycling, so tap 1, discard it, dive for a land similar to the Evolving Wild or Terramorphic Expanse. And the last one is the Woodland Sanctuary, which enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest. Those are the non-basics. As far as the basics goes, we have in this deck, finding the numbers on it, we got 3 swamps, 5 islands, and 6 forests, which give us that land balance that I was talking about before. Notice that all of these lands are pretty much directly straight from the original Fallout deck. I didn't really tweak the land very much. I just reduced and got rid of some of the ones that I felt were not very good, like the ones that don't tap for a colored mana unless you control a swamp specifically. Got rid of those, weeded it down, and made it so that the color balance itself is a lot more even and a lot more reliable. So as I was playing this deck, which I've done a couple of times now, I noticed that it was much faster and much more efficient than the original Mothman commander deck out of the gate from the Precon. It has a lot more mill options, so its mill is a lot more lethal. It also triggers more often, so the 1/1 counters are a lot more lethal. And those were the 2 things that really were sticking out to me about the way that the original deck was playing. So I took those and I decided to focus on those. I deviated away from the tribal that the original deck had, um, but as I was playing it, this deck just started screaming. When you're swinging with about 5 or 6 20/20 unblockables, there's not really a whole lot that your opponents are going to be able to do, and it's not particularly difficult to get there with the way that this deck is set up. So anyway, so that's the new Mothman deck that I've built using from the uh, basis of the original Mothman Precon deck. This is the Mothball. Thanks for watching. In our next video, we'll be switching from the Mothman out of the Sultai color combination, and we'll be getting into the Hail Caesar Mardu color combination. So that'll be a lot of fun. It'll be primarily an attacking based deck. And then we're going to decide whether we're going to scrap it, merge it with a pre-existing deck that I have, rebuild it, what we're going to do with it. But we'll figure all of that out next time. I'll catch you later.